Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm your host, Kiana Canada. Welcome back to Kiana's show. Ladies and gentlemen, before we get into this afternoon's topic or this evening's topic, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Remember that your likes and your shares, what it does is it pushes videos like this up in the algorithm. It tells the algorithm that videos like this are important. I have not seen any evidence as of late that the United States and the Irish governments have halted their activities, their transnational activities. And so I am calling on you to perhaps subscribe to this channel. Ladies and gentlemen, I am going to be building on Sabrina Salvati's video as it relates to protest movements and revolution. Now, I found her video quite informative. There is a lot that I do agree with Sabrina Salvati on, and some things I disagree. We'll talk about that. But as you know, there is a lot of respect that I do have for Sabrina Salvati, and I find her to be just a wonderful person. And we are going to get into her video, Why the Revolution is on Hold. Now, Sabrina, she actually discusses the wants within a protest movement. So she argues that within a protest movement, there are several different areas where individuals' wants aren't being met. So if they go out and protest, do they have a babysitter? Are they provided with lunches? And then there's the needs category where, for example, she argues that are their needs being met as well? Like, is there someone to bail that person out of jail in the event that they are arrested? And I'll be talking about that a little later. And this afternoon, this evening, we're not going to cover all of these topics regarding social movements because there's somewhere that I need to go. But I do want to talk about, what she talks about is the political opportunity theory, which argues that opportunity shifts in favor of some specific person, right? Or some specific part of the movement. And I'm really focusing on that. That's what I really want to focus on. But before we do, I think that this is important because of the times we're in. We need to structure this conversation with some definitions. So revolution, what is a revolution? So revolution started or can be conceptualized as rotation or turn or to revolve. And of course, as you know, it's applied to political or social upheavals. And it refers to the overthrow of a government or the replacement of a system of government. Now, it's important to understand that when we look at overthrowing a government, while sometimes when you overthrow a government, that is usually by force, not all instances of where a government is being overthrown is that by force. And so there is, so as you know, with revolution is distinct from reform or evolution, where change takes place within an enduring constitutional framework. The modern concept of revolution was most clearly influenced by the French Revolution of 1789. And what it did was it set out to destroy the ancien regime, or as it translates to an old order. Now, as Sabrina has stated very eloquently, that revolutions are periods of dramatic and sudden change. They involve, of course, to reiterate, major upheavals. But I want to reiterate that revolutions, they don't need to include bloodshed. Not many people died during the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. So this was a revolutionary period where there was dramatic change and social upheaval, but I think less than 3 people died during that period. Now, I want to get to the key virtue of revolution. So I'm just trying to structure some definitions before we actually talk about this in more detail. So the key virtue of revolution, it deals with the foundational character of a problem. So as you know, we have a defective system, and to cure this defective system, there needs to be revolutionary or systemic change, which many people think, when we think of revolutions, are appropriate, right? So if there is a defective system, then only revolutionary or systemic change is appropriate. Revolutions, what they do is they address specific problems, but sometimes sometimes the problem with why revolutions don't happen is because they can address specific problems but not deeper ones. And we see this a lot, right? We see this a lot, for example, during the Black Lives Matter protest, which some would argue is partly a revolution, but it addressed police brutality and extrajudicial executions. But what it tried to do, and I think where Black Lives Matter, where we were unsuccessful in doing so, is addressing the systemic and institutional elements to that, right? Which anchored policies or anchored procedures or laws that allowed extrajudicial executions and allowed police brutality to continue. Another example is how this is cemented into laws. It's cemented into policies and procedures, laws. I think we could all agree when we look at qualified immunity, this allows, it is a kind of concept or doctrine that allows police officers to continue to evade justice as it relates to an extrajudicial execution or incident of police brutality. Now, reform, it may fail to address fundamental problems and could be a part of the problem. Now, think of police training. This is a good example, is that oftentimes when there is an incident of police brutality or an incident of extrajudicial executions, the government often says that the police need more training. Or you have think tanks or NGOs that come together, and NGOs and these think tanks say, hey, well, the police aren't trained correctly, so they need more training. We need to train them not to go out on the street and profile Black Americans, or we need to train them not to engage in extrajudicial execution, or we need to train them to see Black Americans as they would see other citizens that are driving in their cars or on the streets. And so this is an example of how reform can address fundamental problems, but it could also be a part of the problem because we're giving more funding to police departments who aren't implementing this. They're not implementing the changes that we need to see. Now, that is not to argue that most police departments don't implement the change that we want to see. I concede I've watched a lot of videos, police encounter videos, as well as traffic stops and other videos that involve police coming out on the scene. And there are some videos where I can see and acknowledge that some of the law enforcement officers are putting the training to use. But that is not across the board, right? So this is a very small percentage of officers that tend to do that. And often what we see is ego coming into play, because being a police officer gives a person a lot of power, and it's legitimate power. It is sometimes coercive power. And with these two forms of power, when your legitimacy as a police officer is questioned, then the police officer falls back on its coercive power. And that's when we see instances of police brutality and extrajudicial executions. And you may argue, Kiana, well, what does this have to do with the discussion that Sabrina Salvati had as it relates to revolutions? In her discussion, she talked about multiple different revolutions that involved hunger. And I would agree that hunger does drive people to want to change their circumstance and their situation. But then I would disagree that revolutions need to be hunger based. So I think a majority of the conversation, or majority of the discussion had by Sabrina Salvati was, I think there was a focus on different periods of time where people protested and engaged themselves in revolutions because they did not have enough food to eat. And that does often happen. And she links this with, okay, well, what's happening today? Why aren't people out protesting today? And her number one argument was that, well, people aren't out protesting today is because people have food to eat. And I agree in part that that is correct, but then I disagree in part, and I'll tell you why. So in her video, she talks a lot about, and I 100% would agree with Sabby about cultural resonance. And what is that? So this links participants' grievances to mainstream beliefs and values. And sometimes with these movements that we are seeing today, their values and their beliefs aren't linked to what people are going out and protesting about. And I want to give you examples of failure to address local concerns. So when local concerns are not addressed, people are less likely to get involved in social movements. And this does connect to what Sabrina talks about as it relates to food. Because if a wide swath of people, a legion of people aren't eating or are going without adequate food, then there is likely not going to be a movement, a revolution. Think of what's going on in Gary, Indiana. There are a number of Black residents that are going without food and electricity. And while I would argue that this would not be an incident where there is, this wouldn't be an incident where there would be a revolution, because I think in time, probably within this week, I would argue, and I could be wrong, but I think that this would gain enough momentum where the government would address this concern policy-wise, and that the people would get their electricity back so that they could actually cool down their food, and have safe food to eat. It's disappointing what is happening there in Gary, Indiana, to the people. And, my heart goes out to all of those people. But I don't think that that is a situation that Sabrina Salvati had in mind, Savvy Sabs had in mind. I think what she had in mind was where like an entire country or majority of people within a country is going without food, so that if there is mass starvation, right? And only then would there be, people wanting to engage in a social movement or be called to a revolution. But there are a number of incidents where people have gone without housing and food. And ladies and gentlemen, I think that this is important. When we look to a number of social movements and political protest, there's a number one thing that happens in many of them. Now, I don't see this happening a lot here in Northern Ireland, because I believe that to some degree, 98% of people that live here in Northern Ireland, their needs are being met. But when you look to the United States and there is protest, mass protest happening, especially when there is Black Lives Matter, or when there is protesting against police brutality or extrajudicial executions, a number one action that you see during these protests is looting. Now, I don't agree with looting, but I want to explain to you why I think that is. I think that people loot because their needs are not being met and they are not given enough privileges. So when people loot, you see people walking out of stores with televisions, or not a television, but like flat screen televisions, or shoes, or food, even people grabbing bulks of food. And this is indicative of a segment of the population whose needs aren't being met. Now, I want you to think about it. Think of every looting situation that has happened. Now, the far right will argue that, these are people who are engaging in criminality. These are people who are thugs, etc., right? This is their argument. But ladies and gentlemen, when you look to these situations as it relates to looting, it has not only been Black people that have looted. You see Hispanics out there looting. You see white people out there looting. You see a large, a diverse population, right, of a diversity of people engaged in this action. And to me, to reiterate, that indicates that the population's needs aren't being sufficiently met, and their access to privileges aren't being sufficiently met. And what do I mean by that? To state that clearer, is where you can't buy yourself, a new outfit, right? So people that are unable to buy themselves a new outfit, or buy themselves toiletries, or buy themselves food, or even purchase for themselves like a new flat screen television, are probably more likely to engage in looting when there are periods of protest. Now, there is a caveat. Not all persons engage in looting, and not all persons who experience a lack of privileges or they go without food engage in this kind of behavior. And as it relates to revolutions, or even why there has been a decrease in protest, I think, and this is just my own personal opinion, and anybody who may see this video could disagree with me. I think the reason why, Black people have, specifically Black Americans, have made a decision not to go out and protest as much is because Black people don't like being in jail. We don't like being incarcerated because we're profiled for incarceration every single day. Whereas people within the dominant society or white populations, they're really not profiled for incarceration. So those that have never really been incarcerated or been profiled, racially profiled before, are sometimes excited, and when they do get arrested, or they feel like it's an initiation into a social movement when they get arrested, when and if they do get arrested. Whereas with Black people, we look at the system, especially jails and incarceration in general, as an extension of slavery, because we know that when our ancestors were enslaved, they were denied their freedom. And of course, I don't think that anyone would disagree with me on this, that being in jail is a lack of freedom. You know, being in jail, whether that's within the United States or in other countries, your freedom is deprived. Your liberty is deprived. And so, concluding this point, Black people don't find it exciting to be put in jail or to be incarcerated because we are profiled for it every day of our lives. Another reason why I think that revolutions or protests often fail is because there's a cross-contamination of causes. And when there is a cross-contamination of causes, the protest is like, I think, less likely to be effective. Now, that's different than different groups coming out and saying that they're in solidarity for one issue. Sometimes causes can get cross-contaminated, and protesters are like, okay, what are we really protesting here? Like, I thought the protest was about A, but then now we're talking about B. And some would disagree with me. They would say, well, A and B could be interlinked and could relate to one another. But for some people who really do need clarity when they go out and protest, I think one of the setbacks is where there is a cross-contamination of causes. And then I agree with Sabrina Salvati, Sabby Sabs, on this point, 100% agree with her on this point, and that's no legal support. So if you get arrested, then someone has to bail you out, and that's really not clear from the outset, right? So people go out and protest, and I know that some protest movements are peaceful, and I think it's an unspoken contract that when you go out and you protest, you don't do, or you don't engage in any action that would cause you to come under arrest. But there are particular groups that do engage in tactical violence, or they engage in actions that the whole group could be blamed for. And when that happens, then if the whole group is arrested because one or two people engaged in violent activity, and those people that didn't engage in that don't have anyone to bail them out, then when people see that, then they are less likely, I think they're less likely wanting to support that cause. Another problem that I have recognized and have seen as it relates to protest and revolutions or movements is that, and it builds on this no legal support, is that leaders are often bailed out and they receive recognition. But this often reflects back at protesters as a type of classism, right? Because a lot of the times leaders are doing no more than speaking out about a cause. So leaders of protest movements, they are the face case, and they're popular. They're speaking out about a cause that everyone agrees with. Howsoever, it is the people within the movement or within the protests that may find themselves arrested because they don't have popularity or they're not in a leadership position. And when those persons are arrested and they don't have legal support, then that could really dampen their mood and their willingness to engage in protest, So this is just, I would almost argue, an overparted political activist where they're engaging in many different roles and maybe taking on a lot of burdens and really dedicated to the cause, but then they're not being recognized for such because maybe they're not attractive, or because maybe they're not charismatic, or their nationality is, I guess, not the nationality that many people would find. It's not agreeable to the masses or to the movement. And so this all could be reasons why people stay clear of protest and decide not to engage in it. And I do want to acknowledge that protest, it is conceptually different than a revolution. And one thing that I really want to know is what revolution I think what I would want to know is what kind of political participation would cause a revolution? What kind of political participation would cause a revolution? Now, don't get me wrong. I'm going to be ending this video because I have somewhere to go, but I want to say that I want to reiterate that when it comes to revolution, not all revolutions need to be violent. There does not need to be bloodshed, because there is high profile areas and low profile areas, and sometimes revolutions can be a big dramatic change in policy. Think of Brexit. To some degree, that was sort of a revolution because that was a big dramatic change in policy. And I think that we would all agree that there was not any bloodshed during Brexit. I think it was just many people coming together, agreeing on specific policy positions, and then making those necessary changes. So this goes back to my original question: what political protests or political actions would lead to a revolution? Is there an area within the United States, Northern Ireland, that someone believes needs reform or needs changes? Now, to reiterate, revolutions really aren't about reform or evolutionary change. It's quite the opposite. But is there an area where people think that there needs to be a dramatic change in policy? And all these things I want to know. And ladies and gentlemen, I think that we'll have this discussion in more detailed in another video. I really want to get into a discussion about this because I think it's quite interesting, informative, and educational. And so that is what we're here to do, is we're here to think about these topics as a part of our everyday existence, whether we're informing ourselves or whether we're educating ourselves. And I think that this is worthy of exploring further. And there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to this channel. We are going to talk to you next time. Bye-bye.